peak body for volunteering in New South Wales. Grow communities and bring people together through volunteering.
You're listening to Let's Talk Volunteering. Today we're talking with Paul Muller about the supplementary reports for the New South Wales State of Volunteering Report. Hi everyone, my name is Ben Hillier and I'll be your host on this episode. Today we're talking with Paul Muller from the Centre for Project Innovation about the supplementary reports for the New South Wales State of Volunteering Report. Prior to founding the Centre for Project Innovation, Paul enjoyed 15 years of senior management experience across Australia, Asia and Europe in a wide range of project-driven businesses. He currently advises a diverse community of public, private, not-for-profit organisations on management issues relating to strategy, risk, projects, operations, marketing and people. This episode will cover Standards 2, 5 and 7 of the National Standards for Volunteer Involvement and give you some practical ideas as to how your organisation can meet these standards and strengthen your volunteering practice. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself and give us a bit of an overview of your work relating to volunteering?
Sure, thanks, Ben. Yeah, so I'm an economist by training, a social economist actually, and what that means is I'm interested in quantifying the value created by unpriced public goods. So whereas we know the value of, a litre of milk or a loaf of bread, articulating the value of something like volunteering is really difficult to do. And that's where I've spent a big part of my career. I've been researching in the sector now for 10 or more years since the first State of Volunteering report in Tasmania back in 2014. As well as wrapping this project up, I'm also working currently on projects for Volunteering Victoria, Volunteering Queensland, and also the New Zealand government in this space.
Fantastic. It's great to hear that there's such a wide acceptance of the state of volunteering methodology. It's getting that uptake. That's brilliant.
No, it's cool. It's exciting. And the fact now that it's leading to work like this as well is starting to really crack it open and understand it in a whole heap of different ways. Fantastic.
So can you give me a little bit more background on the supplementary reports and last year's State of Volunteering report?
Yeah, so the State of Volunteering report filled an important gap in our appreciation of volunteering, which is, how do people volunteer in the state of New South Wales? It was, importantly, it was a second report following on from 2020. And that was really cool because now we can start to see if things are changing over time. And, being able to do that in future studies is important. It is limited, though, to the extent that we've got this high-level picture of volunteering, and I guess conversations, with the Centre of Volunteering revealed that people wanted to understand specific aspects or characteristics of volunteering or types of volunteering in a little bit more detail, and the sort of detail that the report couldn't provide. So this was our chance to investigate some new demographics or areas, as we'll talk about in a sec, and talk to people about their lived volunteering experience as opposed to just putting surveys out there and see if, what they were saying lined up with what the data was telling us. And what we did discover is a whole lot more on that journey too. Fantastic.
And it's my understanding that these supplementary reports are based around focus groups. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So the particular groups we looked at were older people, youth, women, sport and volunteering in rural and regional communities. And what we did is we went to 7 locations around the state, Sydney East and Sydney West, as well as Bathurst, Dubbo, Newcastle, Tamworth and Wagga Wagga. And we ran these focus groups from along each of these domains, sort of older people, youth, etc. Had anywhere from sort of 5 to 15 people in each of the focus groups, and really just got them to talk about their volunteering experiences as a complement to the data, if you like. So we didn't put the data in front of them. We just said, what are your motives for volunteering? What's different about your volunteering experience? What are the barriers you face? What are some of the challenges? What's special about the way you volunteer in your demographic or community? And, and what changes would you like to see? So And I got to say, as someone who's been researching in this space for the decade that I was describing, I was blown away by just how little I knew about volunteering.
Right.
But in the same way, a lot of it just made so much sense. So I think that's going to be people's experience reading these reports. They're going to be like, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about it yet that way, but yes, that makes sense. Or maybe it will be okay. Maybe I am pitching this the wrong way if I'm trying to attract youth or whatever that looks like. But yeah, there's so much value in there. I think it's really exciting.
Fantastic. Now, this has resulted in 5 reports, which obviously we're not going to be able to cover in detail in one podcast episode. So I thought we might just dig through some of the key findings and interesting themes. And to kick that off, I'm interested to hear what stood out to you about the cost and value of volunteering in these domains that you looked at.
It was interesting actually saying, understanding the value of each of these domains, because, whereas we have that high level figure, which off the top of my head escapes me, 130 odd billion in New South Wales, was it? No, sorry.
170 roughly.
170, odd billion, sorry. To actually look at it and say, you know what, the volunteering in rural and regional New South Wales actually contributes $50 billion on its own. Or to say, the volunteering of older people, for example, we appreciate the time and energy that older people bring to volunteering, but there's $30 billion worth of value that they're creating as well at a time in their lives when, from a purely market economics point of view, they're not productive, because they're retired. But we're saying, yes, they are incredibly productive, and that productivity they bring creates, $30 billion worth of value. So I think that's fascinating to be able to localize some of these places of value. The other thing too that stood out just on the cost side was, youth disproportionately spending more than, other parts of the community to facilitate their volunteering. And that's because they have things like, added transport costs, for example, in terms of, they might not necessarily have access to a private vehicle the way other older people would, but also things like uniforms and clothing, significantly disproportionate expense for them. Older people, though, they're obviously more conservative with their money, especially if they're, on a potential, they're no longer earning income through work or things like that. So they're a little bit more conservative with their money. They're still able to make tremendously valuable contributions, but on a per volunteer rate that's closer to $5 compared to, $16.50 for youth. So, there's different ways to engage, there's different ways to volunteer, and the costs of volunteering aren't borne equally. And that's something worth considering when framing strategies to engage different demographics.
Right. And were there any of these sort of areas or data points in the research that surprised you?
Yeah, and it's constant. Again, that's a list that's too exhaustive to go through, and I think too, it wasn't just that there was particular data that stood out and surprised me, and I was expecting that, and a lot of it, was confirmatory, for example, but some of it really moved me as well. So there were stories of individuals' experiences, and normally I work with the big data of volunteering, but hearing some of people's individuals' experiences and stories. And the way they informed my outlook and perspective on volunteering was really interesting. I think the thing that got me the most, though, and obviously people shared these stories in confidence in the room, so I can't and don't want to share their detail, especially some of the trauma that they've had.
Oh, of course.
But I should qualify too that wasn't the whole thing. There were also some amazing stories of positive experiences and people making such a difference to not just the people they were serving as volunteers, but to their own lives and stuff as well. But the thing that jumped out at me and surprised me, and this is perhaps a function of my demographic as a Gen X male, white male, with all the privilege and everything that comes with that, was to hear women talk about their challenges and issues around personal safety and how it impacted their volunteering. So I think, and that comes out in the report. And that's not to say that, it was experienced by every woman in every circumstance, but not just how they perceived and how their interaction with volunteering was, governed to an extent. by their own personal safety and how, some people had very bad experiences, but other people had very supportive and good experiences too. But I think intergenerationally how that was framed. So older women, so people of my age and older, the Gen X, the baby boomers and stuff, didn't really see the safety issue in the same way that younger women did. So millennials and Gen Zs, they were quite vocal in saying, no, this isn't right. This isn't appropriate. This shouldn't be this way. And the older women in the same groups were sort of saying, like, well, no, it's not an issue for me. But the more these conversations went on, the older women were saying, well, hang on, yes, this is an issue. I've just internalized it, or I've just put all these coping mechanisms and strategies in place
Right.
to deal with it in a way that I wasn't aware of. And certainly as a guy, as an outsider, I wasn't aware of either. So I think, the assumption that volunteering is somehow different and because it is comes from a philanthropic and a space, people volunteer for generous reasons. That doesn't mean that it's automatically, safe or happy. The same issues that you have in traditional workplaces, you have with volunteer workforces as well. And things like, the physical safety of women, the psychological safety of young volunteers and stuff were all interesting things that came out in the courses of our conversation, which we do touch on and introduce in the reports.
Right. That's a really interesting observation.
Yeah, and just a real privilege to be in a room and have people open up the way they did about that and a whole range of issues. I think was it's great. Yeah, from a purely personal perspective, as a researcher in this space and as someone who deals with the big data, to actually see behind the data, and that's what these reports do. Take you beyond the data to actually connect it to personal experience in a way that I think is actually quite powerful.
And looking at something like the youth report, did that have much of a discussion around youth participation rates and barriers to involvement? It's one of the things that we hear often is that young people don't volunteer, but the data continually contradicts that perspective. So I'm curious what the report said about it.
Yeah, look, youth, absolutely. Yeah, the data, when we dive deep into the data on the youth side, it absolutely confirms that they do have the highest participation rates and stuff. One thing, though, that's quite interesting in this regard is that, the motive of youth to volunteer, the motivations, the barriers and the challenges that they face are actually quite different to the experiences of other demographics. And potentially the older the volunteer manager, the less aware, as I was unaware of the issues that women were facing, but the less aware they are of the differences between them and youth. So, for example, when youth talk about their motives to volunteer, they're far more likely to say that they're motivated to develop, by developing new skills or to gain confidence, which is really interesting, or for enjoyment, just doing it for fun. Yeah, and they're far less likely to say, I'm motivated to help others. Now, that's not to say they're not doing it to help others. And, one thing we heard a bit, and you hear anecdotally all the time, is that, the youth are volunteering for the wrong reasons. They're doing it to pad their resumes and stuff. And to that, I say, they're not volunteering for the wrong reasons. They're just not volunteering for your reasons. And, whereas older people are far more likely to be motivated just to be active or to help others. Now, that's not to say that those are invalid reasons or, both of them are very valid. And when we say they're more likely to be motivated by these different reasons, it doesn't mean that they're ignorant of or not motivated at all by the other reasons. But when you're looking to attract and engage youth as volunteers, understanding their specific motives, understanding their specific barriers to volunteering, and I touched on before cost being a big one for youth, if you can address and intercept them, you're far more likely not only to be able to recruit, but retain and engage your youth volunteers.
Fantastic. Were there any particular demographic factors that impacted one of the group's ability to volunteer?
Yeah, this was quite interesting. One of the things, so people who identified as a caregiver, for example, as you'd expect, women who identified as caregivers were far more likely to see this as a barrier to volunteering. Whereas, something like sport was seen as a place that was great for people with caregiving responsibilities as a place where they could volunteer. And but then sport was very male dominated by volunteers. So, that was interesting. But also what was really interesting was older people who identified as caregivers also said that was an especial barrier for them relative to the rest of the population. And something that came through in the conversations quite strongly was that, older people are it's sometimes forgotten that older people have these caregiving responsibilities that place, quite reasonable and often unexpected constraints on their time, whether that's caring for grandchildren, whether that's caring, you can be in your 60s and still be caring for a parent. That's quite, normal, in your 60s and 70s and caring for a parent who's in their 90s, for example. And also caring for your own partner and, transporting them to, their medical appointments and things like that. So, thinking of caregiving as a barrier to volunteering only for parents and, women especially is a narrow way of thinking it. Things like, in rural and regional Australia, one of the biggest, a much more disproportionate barrier for people who spoke English as an additional language, not their first language, perhaps. And we know that, when we went to the regional communities we went to, especially places like, Tamworth and Newcastle and, Bathurst as well, a lot of migrant popular Wagga as well. A lot of migrant communities coming in there. In Bathurst and Wagga was for educational opportunities, Tamworth for employment opportunities, Newcastle for educational opportunities as well. But the fact that their English, wasn't native was a notable barrier for them with their volunteering that we just didn't see in people living in major cities, for example. And also to persons LGBTQIA plus status. So, their sexual identity was particularly seen as a barrier or a challenge for youth and people volunteering in sport, as well as age and gender were also seen as barriers in those spaces as well. So I mentioned before, sport being a very male-dominated space quite often. That was quite interesting.
And did the focus groups make any recommendations around the broad areas you discussed in them?
It was off the show. Like when you read the reports, it's really hard to write something that isn't just a summary of recommendations. I mean, one of the really cool things about the process we went through is and perhaps this is the nature of people who come to focus groups like this thing. They were very passionate, not just about their own volunteering and the volunteering in their organisation, but how can we make this better? And there were some really valuable recommendations. Now, we do list them quite extensively throughout the reports. So, if there's a space you're interested, you can mine them across all of those aspects of volunteering, recruitment, retention, etc. But we did give our best effort at kind of summarising them as well, just in conclusion, just to make sense of them. And one of the things that every demographic said, this was universally felt, was that they want to see an increase in flexibility in roles and commitments for people who are volunteering. So they want more flexibility. I think, we can safely say that although it may be attractive to a segment of the population, that coming along once a week between 12 and 5 and, serving as a volunteer in the same job every week, there is still a space for that, but it's a diminishing space.
Right.
Don't just want flexibility in terms of their commitment. They also want role flexibility as well, so to be able to do different things within their roles. And again, if we want to stereotype the older volunteer as being that person who, comes 12 to 5 every Tuesday or whatever, that's wrong too. Older people have bought caravans. They want to go travel. They want to go enjoy their lives. The baby boomers who are moving into retirement now are wealthier than any generation has ever been before them. So they don't necessarily want to be tied down to, that single job, single role. And they're the most skilled and experienced generation we've ever had, the most knowledgeable generation we've had. So it's not just about youth. It's not just about, people in sport. I don't want to operate the scoreboard every week forever. It's across all dimensions, all people. That said, there were unique findings for each demographic. I've already spoken about women in safety. For sport, one of the biggest barriers and challenges is abuse of volunteers, whether they're match officials or whether they're coaches or whether they're administrators. That came out really strong. In rural and regional New South Wales, burnout was something that, there were a lot of recommendations around how do we address that. For youth, it was an interesting one, was just around the brand. volunteering as an idea, as a concept, when you talk to each other, is a daggy old people thing, or it's seen as unpaid work when we know that volunteering is much more than that. So how do we brand volunteering to show its true value to get to people? And for older people, especially, accessibility was a big issue, and role modification over the course of their career as perhaps their physical or even cognitive abilities gradually declined. Being able to find ways to keep them in the role through that process of aging was seen as really important to make it accessible to them.
Brilliant. Was there anything else around these topics you'd like to comment on?
Oh, look, one thing that kind of, I guess you can probably take as a theme of this conversation too, is that we can't homogenize volunteers. We can't just assume that every volunteer thinks and acts and behaves the same way. And I can't remember who it was, but a year or so ago when I was doing this work, the big data work, someone asked me to come up with, actually quite a few people asked this, can you give us the avatar of the, typical volunteer? Is it, a young white woman who's in study, or is it a middle-aged man like myself with a magnificent moustache who gives his time this way or whatever? And I was really reluctant to do it, and I pushed back and didn't do it because I thought that was damaging, because whenever you say this is the typical volunteer, you're actually excluding all these other people, and they can't see themselves in that person. And I think this process, but these reports really hammer this message home. It is useful to think of volunteers in clusters. I mean, it's not practical to treat every, to recruit volunteers one by, have a unique marketing message to say, hey, Tom Jones or, Ray Chi or whoever you are, this is a unique customized message for you. But you can't expect a one-size-fits-all message in terms of recruitment or engagement or reward or recognition or whatever that looks like, or barriers to be a one-size-fits-all. This process and these reports do dive deeper into some demographics and really start to highlight some of these differences in the community. But, the message is, and I think, your audience will know that, the best volunteer managers are the ones who know their volunteers as individuals and treat them as such. What this report potentially, or what these reports potentially do, is give you perhaps some guidance as how to, one, think outside your own box, but also connect with different people in different ways.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Paul, for your time today, sharing your advice and expertise. What can people do if they want to find out more about your work?
Centre for Volunteering website's a pretty good place to start. Look, that's where a lot of this stuff is. We're also doing more and more of this sort of work specifically for organisations directly. Like, so, for larger organisations, they want to say, well, what do our volunteers look like? Whether that's what's the value that's created by them, or how do we communicate better or engage better with the volunteers? The centre does some fantastic work, and I'm always excited to partner with the centre and other state peak bodies to make this stuff happen.
Fantastic. Well, for readers or listeners who are interested in reading the reports, they can be found on the Centre for Volunteering's website at volunteering.com.au under the Resources and Tools heading. And that's some brilliant reading, the key findings and each individual report as you're interested. Well, thank you again for your time, Paul. I hope our listeners have found today's show interesting and enlightening, and I look forward to seeing you all on the next episode. Bye for now.
You've been listening to Voices of Volunteering, presented by the Centre for Volunteering. For resources, tools, training and news, head over to our website, volunteering.com.au.